Ireland, a verdant jewel in the eastern Atlantic, Europe's most western frontier. From the towering cliffs of its wild sea coasts to unique geological formations forged by volcanic fire, Ireland is a land of spectacular natural beauty, the glorious backdrop of more than 10,000 years of human civilization. From a city of the dead that's older than the pyramids of Egypt, to the beach where director Steven Spielberg filmed the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. Where else would you find the country home of the Lord of the Dance and the birthplace of the Titanic? Ancient ruins that bring Game of Thrones to life. And a national sport that became the ancestor of ice hockey. A country whose rich cultural legacy and living history inspired generations of storytellers. This is an Ireland you've never seen before. A nation whose unique blend of tradition and modernity has made it a bastion of the digital age. Sunrise in Dublin, Ireland's capital city on the country's east coast. Inhabited since prehistoric times, Dublin's city origins lie with the invading Vikings, who sailed up the River Liffey in the 10th century AD to establish a settlement here. 1,000 years on, Dublin is a city of 1.3 million people, from the streets built on Viking foundations to the medieval majesty of Dublin Castle and the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Dublin's architectural legacy is writ large. Among its most celebrated and historic precincts are the great Georgian squares laid out in the 18th century, a golden age that would also witness the foundation of Dublin's most iconic commercial enterprise. This is St. James's Gate Brewery, ancestral home of the black stuff, Guinness Stout, one of Ireland's most recognizable brands. In 1759, when the Irish brewer and entrepreneur Arthur Guinness took out a 9,000-year lease on St. James's Gate, he was supplied with crystal clear water from the Wicklow Mountains to brew his beer free of charge. At the heart of the brewery stands the famous Guinness Storehouse. This 7-story museum dedicated to the company's history is topped with a sky bar where visitors enjoy a free sample of the famous brew and panoramic views of a city still in the process of monumental change. Since the 1990s, the once derelict Dublin Docklands have been transformed into a vibrant new residential and business quarter. It's known as the Digital Docklands, or alternatively, Silicon Dock. Overshadowed by Dublin's tallest commercial building, Hyperlink, the European headquarters of Google. Downstream, the 680-foot red and white striped chimneys of Poolbeg are one of Dublin's most beloved and iconic landmarks. Immortalized in the music video for Pride by the city's most famous musical export, U2. Ireland's best-known rock group started life here at Mount Temple School in the North Dublin suburbs, when in 1974, a young drummer named Larry Mullen posted a notice looking for like-minded musicians to form a band. Lead singer Bono grew up here at Cedarwood Road in the North City, a suburb made famous by U2's album Songs of Innocence. U2 have left their mark all over Dublin. The band once owned the Clarence Hotel in Temple Bar, the city's cultural quarter. Bono now resides here at Temple Hill, a grand mansion in the salubrious suburb of Killiney, where his neighbors have included singer Enya, film director Neil Jordan, and Formula One racing driver Eddie Irvine. For a few years in the 1980s, Bono lived here at the glass-roofed Martello Tower in the seaside town of Bray, south of Dublin. One of over 50 military forts dotted around the Irish coast, they were decommissioned in the 19th century, but have attracted artists and writers ever since. Among them, the great Irish novelist James Joyce. One of the finest writers of the 20th century, James Joyce spent most of his life abroad, and yet virtually all his work centers on Dublin, capturing the spirit of the city in the early 1900s. His masterpiece, the novel Ulysses, begins here at the Martello Tower, beside the famous 40-foot swimming spot in the picturesque South Dublin suburb of Sandycove. Here in September 1904, Joyce spent 6 nights with fellow writer Oliver St. John Gogarty, on whom he based one of Ulysses' main characters, the irrepressible Buck Mulligan. On the final night of his stay, Joyce was jolted awake as Gogarty fired a revolver into the pots and pans overhanging Joyce's bed. Soon afterwards, Joyce left Ireland, never forgotten, but never to return. He wasn't the only writer whose legacy remains written into the fabric of the city. Here on Merrion Square in central Dublin is a monument to the great poet, wit, and literary genius Oscar Wilde. Born in Dublin in 1854, Wilde became one of the greatest playwrights of the 19th century. But the author of The Importance of Being Earnest and The Picture of Dorian Gray was also a victim of the prejudice of his time. Imprisoned in England for 2 years on account of his homosexuality, Wilde would remain defiant, dignified, and above all, a Dubliner. "Be yourself," Wilde once said. "Everyone else is already taken." This reclining statue with its sardonic grace is a fitting tribute to one of Ireland's most colorful and celebrated writers. Another of Dublin's 19th century literary masters was Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. Born in 1847 here at Marino Crescent in the North Dublin suburb of Clontarf, Stoker is said to have based some of the morbid details of Dracula on his mother's recollections of the cholera epidemic that swept Ireland in 1832, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Stoker and Oscar Wilde knew each other well, having spent time together as students at Dublin's most famous university, Trinity College. Established in 1592 by Queen Elizabeth I, Trinity is Ireland's oldest university, modeled on the great English colleges of Oxford and Cambridge. Along with 200,000 of the college's oldest and rarest books, Trinity's 18th century old library displays an extraordinary national treasure on its ground floor, the Book of Kells, an intricate illuminated manuscript dating from around 800 AD. Containing the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, laid out in vibrantly illustrated Celtic script, the Book of Kells is one of the most priceless medieval artifacts on Earth. Another historically important document enshrined here is a copy of the Irish Proclamation of 1916.
Irishmen.
When rebel leader Pádraic Pearse read the proclamation beneath the portico of Dublin's General Post Office, it was one of the most significant events of 20th century Irish history. It signaled the start of the Easter Rising, a momentous rebellion against nearly 800 years of British colonial rule. In 1916, hundreds of Irish rebels took up defensive positions around Dublin, using the post office on O'Connell Street as their headquarters. Defeated by British forces after a week of bloody fighting, their sacrifice sent 26 of Ireland's 32 counties on the road to independence. Ultimately, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom. On March 17th, the world celebrates the feast day of St. Patrick, Ireland's patron saint. The symbol of this national holiday is the shamrock, a three-leafed clover St. Patrick is said to have used to explain the mystery of the Holy Trinity to his pagan converts. The St. Patrick's Day Parade in Dublin is the biggest and most colorful outside of New York City, with 500,000 Dubliners and 100,000 visitors from around the world lining the streets for the most joyful open-air party of the year. The parade route leads from O'Connell Street to St. Patrick's Cathedral, whose 18th century dean was also one of Ireland's most famous writers, Jonathan Swift. Although Swift is largely associated with Dublin, his holiday home here in the Irish Midlands inspired his most famous book. This is Lilliput House on the south shore of Lough Ennell in County Westmeath. It's said that while boating out on the lake, Swift was struck by how small people looked on the distant shoreline. It became the seed of an idea for the novel Gulliver's Travels. On the far side of the lake stands the imposing 18th century mansion of Belvedere House. The sinister legacy of its owner is said to have inspired the novelist Charlotte Bronte to write the dark classic Jane Eyre. Landowner Robert Rochfort was a cruel and petty man. Incensed when his older brother built a much grander house nearby, Rochfort had a huge Gothic ruin constructed to block it from view. Known as the Jealous Wall, the folly still stands, a monument to one man's bitterness and spite. "50 miles east of Belvedere House in the neighboring county of Meath stands a monument of an altogether different kind. Over 5,000 years old, it was built to connect the living and the dead. The ancient Irish believed that the living and the dead shared the earth, drawn together by the changing seasons and aligned by the light of the sun, a sophisticated spirituality that they enshrined in great earthen cemeteries. Here on a bend of the River Boyne in County Meath stands the necropolis of Brú na Bóinne. Built 1,000 years before the earliest Egyptian pyramid, this great 2,000-acre city of the dead contains over 40 ancient tombs. 12 meters high and 67 meters across, the great earthen mound of Knowth contains 2 burial chambers where the cremated remains of the dead were placed. A mile southeast lies the centerpiece of Brú na Bóinne, Newgrange, a tomb containing a single burial chamber ringed with shining quartz rock and inscribed with mysterious Neolithic symbols. It was built around 3200 BC. But this is more than just a tomb. At the winter solstice, the rays of dawn shine along a precisely aligned stone shaft built into the mound, illuminating the burial chamber deep within. A symbolic moment, signaling renewal, rebirth, and the start of a new year. Carved out by glaciers during the last ice age, the stunning lake valley of Glendalough in the Wicklow Mountains south of Dublin is home to one of Ireland's oldest monastic sites. In the 6th century, the hermit monk Saint Kevin is said to have lived here in the hollow of a tree, communing with God far from the distractions of the world. With Europe plunged into the turmoil of the Dark Ages, Ireland was a beacon of light. Glendalough would evolve into a great monastic complex overshadowed by an elegant medieval Irish round tower. With their doors placed high above ground level, these buildings were once thought to offer refuge against Viking raiders. It's more likely, however, that they were bell towers and storehouses for religious relics. Overshadowed by its modern basilica, the town of Knock in the west of Ireland is one of the country's most revered Catholic pilgrimage sites. Here, one rainy night in the fall of 1879, 15 people claimed to have witnessed an extraordinary apparition, a vision of the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, and Saint John the Evangelist, all three standing motionless above the ground, deep in prayer. Some say it was a hoax, others claim a miracle. Either way, the meaning of the reported apparition remains a mystery. According to another mysterious Irish legend, the devil himself took a bite out of this mountain in Tipperary and spat it out here, forming a hill called the Rock of Cashel. A spectacular ecclesiastical site occupies the summit of the rock, surrounded by a ring of ancient fortifications. At its core, a complete medieval round tower and the ruin of a Gothic cathedral. This was the ancient seat of Ireland's kings, the most famous of whom was Brian Boru, who attempted to unify the whole island under one rule. In 1014 AD, his armies defeated the Vikings of Dublin. Though Brian Boru was killed on the field of battle, his victory secured peace and prosperity at a time of intense tribal war in Ireland. The wild beauty of the Wicklow Mountains forms the backdrop to dozens of grand country estates. Here in a quiet valley at the north end of Loch Tay is one of the finest, the fairy tale castle of Luggalaw. Owned by Gareth de Bruyne of the Guinness family, the castle has hosted some fabulous parties over the years, attended by celebrities like Angelica Houston and Mick Jagger. The Luggalaw estate has featured in Hollywood epics from King Arthur to Braveheart. More recently, the valley doubled as a Scandinavian fjord for the TV saga Vikings. If Curracloe Strand in County Wexford seems strangely familiar, it's probably because you've seen this glorious stretch of sand and dunes before. Imagine the roar of landing craft and the deafening sound of machine guns and artillery. In 1997, Curracloe doubled as Omaha Beach in the brutal opening scenes of Steven Spielberg's World War II epic, Saving Private Ryan. The imposing fortress of Trim Castle in County Meath featured extensively in Mel Gibson's Braveheart. Doubling as the besieged citadel of York and London's medieval Smithfield, where the hero William Wallace is executed. Built in 1173 by the Anglo-Norman Baron Hugh de Lacy, the castle was once a powerful symbol of English rule in Ireland. In the 1970s, excavations revealed 10 headless skeletons, the remains of executed thieves whose heads were mounted on spikes on the castle walls. In the late Middle Ages, the fortress defended the outer edge of the Pale, the part of East Ireland dominated by the English. Everything outside was considered the lawless, uncivilized domain of the native Irish, hence the phrase, "beyond the Pale." Far from the supposed civilization of the medieval Pale lies one of Ireland's most unique natural terrains, an ancient landscape filled with extraordinary secrets. Here on the Atlantic coast of County Clare lies one of Ireland's most extraordinary natural landscapes, the 96-square-mile limestone terrain of the Burren. A sacred place since prehistory, the Burren is dotted with ancient ruins, from churches to tombs, all symbolizing a connection between this world and the next. Here, the temperature of the bedrock remains above 43 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, supporting an incredibly rich and diverse ecosystem where Arctic, Mediterranean, and alpine plants grow side by side. The region is home to 3/4 of Ireland's wildflowers, including rare orchids thriving alongside hundreds of insect species. At the southwestern edge of the Burren stand the spectacular cliffs of Moher. Rising at Hag's Head in the south, they reach their highest point, over 700 feet, 5 miles to the north. This is O'Brien's Tower. Built in 1835 by the Irish politician Sir Cornelius O'Brien. An early pioneer of tourism, he was so prolific that the locals say he built everything around here except the cliffs. Every year, 1 million visitors come to marvel at the spectacular panorama. The nearby town of Lahinch, with its vast Atlantic beaches, is one of Ireland's most popular surfing destinations. Here in the summer of 2006, 44 surfers managed to ride the same crest, setting a new world record. At the edge of Clew Bay on the Mayo coast, a medieval Irish tower stands guard over the waters. This is Rock Fleet, once the home of the powerful 16th century pirate queen, Grace O'Malley, who commanded a private army, her own fleet of ships, and a string of fortresses along the Atlantic coast. In 1593, she sailed her pirate galleon up the Thames to London to parley with the English Queen Elizabeth I. O'Malley initially shocked the Queen's courtiers by refusing to bow, but the meeting went well. Though the pirate queen never achieved her goal of freedom for her people, she died unconquered, a rebel to the very end. 250 years after the time of Grace O'Malley, the landscape of Ireland was changed forever. These abandoned cottages are ghostly reminders of the Great Famine of 1845. At the time, nearly 3.5 million people, the poorest 2/5 of Ireland's population, were entirely dependent on a single crop, the potato. A devastating blight wiped out harvests across the country. On the hill of Slieve Moor are all that remains of a once thriving farming community. These ridged terraces, known as lazy beds, once supplied the inhabitants with the one crop that kept them alive. In the space of 10 years, 1 million died, and a further 1 million emigrated to America and Canada. As they poured into Ellis Island, the country they left behind was damaged in ways that have never been forgotten. One of the many famines of Irish history, the Great Hunger of 1845, has left the most lasting mark on the Irish psyche, a symbol of the oppression and abandonment of a dispossessed people. The lush pastures and dramatic seascapes of County Sligo were once a rich source of inspiration for one of Ireland's most celebrated poets. This is the tabletop mountain of Benbulben, a great limestone plateau sculpted by glaciers during the last ice age. From the top, climbers enjoy panoramic views of the spectacular landscape known as Yeats Country. The poem Under Benbulben was one of the last written by William Butler Yeats. The closing lines are famously inscribed on his tombstone here at the churchyard of Drumcliff in Sligo. Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen, pass by. Another champion of the unspoiled beauty of the west of Ireland was the American director John Ford. Cong Village in County Mayo was the backdrop to his iconic 1952 film, The Quiet Man, starring John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. Many of its locations are still preserved, including the scene of the film's epic fistfight. On the far side of Loch Oughterard stands the Quiet Man Bridge, where Wayne's character, the returned emigrant Sean Thornton, spies his family home for the first time. The elegant Ashford Castle also figures in Ford's film. One of Ireland's most exclusive five-star hotels, its illustrious guests have included King George V, Oscar Wilde, Ronald Reagan, and Beatle George Harrison. Galway City at the mouth of the Corrib River is the de facto capital of the west of Ireland. Galway, nicknamed City of the Tribes, originates with the 14 ruling merchant clans who made it a hub of international commerce during the Middle Ages. The city was once Ireland's main port of trade with France and Spain. The medieval church of St. Nicholas has seen many famous visitors over the years, including Christopher Columbus, who prayed here some years before his historic voyage to the New World. The city's annual film festival continues to attract latter-day celebrities too, including the star of The West Wing, Martin Sheen. In 2006, at the age of 66, he enrolled as a student of English literature, philosophy, and theology at the University of Galway. Nestled in the mouth of Galway Bay are the three Aran Islands, Inishmore, Inishmaan, and Inisheer. They're home to some of the oldest archaeological remains in Ireland. Early Christian beehive huts, meandering prehistoric dry stone walls, and ancient strongholds, including the Iron Age fort of Dunangus, constructed between 1100 and 500 BC. Perched atop a 330-foot cliff on Inishmore, the fort was once a complete oval before the outer edge of the cliff collapsed into the sea. The first language of Aran is Irish. Here, the country's official tongue is preserved zealously and spoken daily. Galway's Gaeltacht region is home to national broadcasting institutions, including the country's leading Irish language radio station and TV network. 12 miles west of Galway City, the picturesque coastal village of Spittal is also known as Rossnaroon, or Glen of Secrets, filming location of the country's best-loved Irish language soap opera. Until the Middle Ages, Gaelic was the predominant language of the Irish people. Since the Great Famine of the 19th century, which deprived the country of 2 million native speakers, Irish has been in decline. Once the second most spoken language after English, it's now third after Polish. And yet its legacy remains strong. English, as spoken in Ireland, has a structure, rhythm, and vocabulary all based on Irish. A prime example being the Irish word crack, meaning fun, mischief, and good times. Clearly defined to the world during one memorable U.S. presidential visit. In the summer of 2011, President Barack Obama turned the sleepy hamlet of Moneygall, population 300, into the biggest little village in the West. The cause of the media frenzy was one Falmouth Carney, a 19-year-old shoemaker who emigrated from Moneygall to New York City in 1850. Local historians discovered he was none other than President Obama's maternal great-great-grandfather. When the first couple came to town, they were greeted by crowds of locals, including Henry Healy, the president's eighth cousin, known locally as Henry VIII. After a visit to his ancestral home, the president spent an evening at Ollie Hayes' pub, pulling pints with enraptured locals, with the world's media gathered outside. Unveiled 3 years after the historic visit, the Barack Obama Plaza has given this once remote rural backwater a whole new lease of life. An estimated 100 million people around the world claim Irish ancestry. President Obama was only one of many Americans keen to reconnect with their Irish roots. Here on the banks of the River Blackwater in County Cork, stands the magnificent Palladian mansion of Castlehyde House. Bought and refurbished to the tune of $34 million by Irish-American entertainer and undisputed lord of the dance, Michael Flatley. The Riverdance star wasn't the first celebrated owner. Castlehyde was once the family home and childhood residence of Gaelic scholar Douglas Ross Hyde, the man who in 1938 became the first president of Ireland. 20 miles south of Castlehyde stands an even more famous castle, a place where, as legend has it, the gift of the gab was born. 600 years ago, the Irish chieftain Cormac McCarthy built a castle at Blarney near Cork City, little knowing the fame it would one day enjoy. For decades, eager tourists have come here to kiss the Blarney Stone, a limestone block built into the top of the castle's battlement tower. According to legend, the stone bestows the gift of the gab, a magical ability to converse fluently. To kiss the stone, visitors must literally bend over backwards, suspended beyond the edge of the parapet. At one time, the kiss involved a real risk to life and limb, as participants were taken by the ankles and dangled from the battlements. This is Killarney National Park in the neighboring county of Kerry. 40 square miles of lakes and woodland, home to native species from oak and yew forests to herds of Irish red deer that have thrived here since the Ice Age. Killarney's three lakes are framed by the great McGillicuddy Reeks mountain range, where a dangerous 3,500-foot ascent leads to the summit of Ireland's highest peak, Carrantoul. To the north lies the historic town of Killarney, childhood home of actor Michael Fassbender, star of 12 Years a Slave and X-Men. The Hollywood star attended school here at St. Brendan's College, but the town has an even more impressive former resident. Killarney was once home to a man justifiably regarded as the Oscar Schindler of Ireland. Born in 1898, Hugh O'Flaherty grew up here at the local golf course, where his father worked as a steward. Taking religious orders as a young man, he was posted to the Vatican during World War II. Using the Irish embassy as his refuge, O'Flaherty operated a secret network, hiding Jewish refugees and Allied soldiers in safe houses around the city. He was so adept at evading the Gestapo that he became known as the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, eventually saving 6,500 people from the Nazis. The Monsignor died in 1965. Today, a monument to his honor stands in Killarney town. Separated from the mainland by a deep chasm, the peninsula of Mizen Head in County Cork is Ireland's most southern extreme. 290 miles north as the crow flies, Malin Head Lighthouse in Donegal is the most northerly point. One of the great unspoiled wilderness terrains of Ireland, County Donegal extends across 1,800 square miles of the northwest. A third of the population speak Irish as their first language. Up here, as the locals say, it's different. In the east of the county, the monastic site of Station Island on Lough Derg hides a subterranean cave where the 5th century St. Patrick is said to have experienced a vision of heaven and hell. For centuries, pilgrims came here to atone for their sins. In 1763, the original monastery was replaced by a basilica where the faithful still come to pray, fasting for 3 days as they walk barefoot around the remains of the old monastic cells. Sealed in 1632, St. Patrick's Cave has never been opened since. The most westerly of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, Fermanagh is known as the Lake County, and from above it's easy to see why. The terrain is dominated by the great expanse of Lough Erne, 2 connected lakes dotted with 154 islands and a maze of inlets and peninsulas. In 1994, this great waterway was linked by a 40-mile canal to the Shannon River in the south, creating a continuous navigable passage between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Belfast, on the east coast of Northern Ireland, is Ireland's second largest city after Dublin. Its administrative centre, City Hall, celebrates a charter granted in 1888 by Queen Victoria. In the late 19th century, Belfast was the world's largest linen producer and one of Britain's great industrial powerhouses. But Belfast also bears the scars of Northern Ireland's sectarian conflict. The Europa, in the city centre, has a dark claim to fame. Attacked no fewer than 28 times, it's arguably the world's most bombed hotel. The bitter 30-year legacy of the Troubles can still be seen today. Sectarian division is evident in the high reinforced peace lines that separate 2 of the city's neighboring communities. On the left, the Shankill, loyal to Britain. On the right, the Falls Road, dedicated to a united Ireland. If there's one industry that has defined Belfast more than any other, it's shipbuilding. The Harland and Wolff shipyard on Queen's Island in East Belfast, overshadowed by its 2 towering gantry cranes, Samson and Goliath, was originally founded in 1861. Here in 1909, work began on the world's largest passenger vessel, RMS Titanic. This sculptural building houses the Titanic Belfast Visitor Experience, a museum celebrating the construction of the world's most tragic ocean liner. More than 800 feet long and 100 feet high, Titanic required a huge expansion of the shipyard and a workforce of over 3,000 men, 8 of whom died during construction. To the north of Belfast lies one of Northern Ireland's most evocative landscapes, the County Antrim coast. Some know it by another name, the Kingdom of Westeros. Once home to powerful Gaelic families, County Antrim in northeast Ulster is a landscape of ancient fortresses, dramatic seascapes, and towering cliffs. No wonder that it was chosen as the location for one of the most famous TV sagas of recent years, Game of Thrones. Teetering precariously on steep cliffs overlooking the North Atlantic stands the dramatic Dunluce Castle, also known as the House of Greyjoy. The castle was once the stronghold of the Irish and Scottish clans MacDonald and MacDonald. According to local legend, part of the kitchen collapsed and fell into the sea, leaving one survivor, a serving boy sitting in the only remaining corner of the destroyed room. But of all the atmospheric locations in Northern Ireland, one stands out. As if tumbling into the sea on the rugged North Antrim coast, the Giant's Causeway, formed after a period of intense volcanic activity, is one of the most distinctive rock formations anywhere on Earth. Between 50 and 60 million years ago, lava, cooling and cracking like mud in the sun, formed some 40,000 interlocking hexagonal basalt columns. Over eons, the columns have been weathered by the wind and waves, creating distinctive towers and mounds of rock. According to legend, the causeway is the ruin of a land bridge to Scotland, created by the Irish giant Finn McCool. after being challenged to a fight by the Scottish giant Benandonner. A fight he gladly accepted and won. This old train, traveling along 2 miles of narrow-gauge track, links the Giant's Causeway with the historic town of Bushmills, home to the oldest licensed whiskey distillery in the world, founded in 1608. Though the Scots and the Irish both claim to have invented whiskey, most historians maintain that its origins are actually Moorish or Arabic. Throughout the 20th century, various factors from U.S. prohibition to trade disputes left the Irish whiskey industry in decline. By the 1970s, Bushmills was one of only 2 surviving distilleries. These days there are 12, and the future looks safe. Of course, the Irish hold no grudge against their American cousins. How could they? The links between the 2 countries are stronger than the fieriest malt. The game of hurling is one of Ireland's most popular national sports. Played on a 100 by 160-yard field, opposing teams pass and strike a leather ball called a slither with flattened sticks called hurls, scoring points above and below the crossbar of the goalposts at either end. Played on the frozen ponds of Nova Scotia by Irish immigrants in the 18th century, the game would one day evolve into the modern sport of ice hockey. Welcome to the other Hollywood, famous for entirely different reasons. This is Hollywood Golf Club in County Down, the first training ground of former world #1 golfer Rory McIlroy. Introduced to the game by his father at age 7, Rory was the youngest member of the club and could once be seen practicing here every day. 20 years on, McIlroy is a 4-time Majors champion, winning the 2011 U.S. Open with a tournament record-beating score. Derry, in the northwest of Ulster, is Ireland's 4th largest city. At its heart stands one of the most impressive city walls in Europe. 26 feet high and 30 feet wide, the battlements, built in 1618, have never been breached, hence the nickname Maiden City. Derry has had a troubled history. On January 30th, 1972, British troops opened fire on a peaceful civil rights march in the city's Bogside area, killing 14 civilians. The atrocity inspired one of U2's most famous songs, Sunday, Bloody Sunday. Since the end of the Troubles in 1998, the mood here has changed. Completed in 2011, the sinuous walkway of the Peace Bridge has unified a city whose name is a legacy of old divisions. To the mainly Protestant population of the waterside, it's Londonderry, after the London trade guilds who founded the walled town. To Catholics on the city side, it's simply Derry. The Peace Bridge, linking both communities, is a symbol of renewed hope. In 2013, the County Antrim town of Ballymena honored its most famous son, the actor Liam Neeson, star of Schindler's List and Star Wars. Neeson was born and raised here, attending St. Patrick's College, the high school that inspired his love of drama and gave him his first acting role, a school play in which he played the lead at the tender age of 11. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn may not have survived the Phantom Menace, but the Star Wars franchise would return to Ireland. Rising 700 feet above the Atlantic, 7.5 miles west of County Kerry, stands the towering sea crag of Skellig Michael, once home to a community of monks who founded a settlement here in the 6th century. Uninhabited since medieval times, Skellig Michael is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A strictly limited number of visitors are admitted during the summer months. A winding path of 618 stone steps leads to the summit and the perfectly formed beehive huts where the monks lived a quiet life of contemplation. In 2014, this became the extraordinary climactic location of Star Wars: The Force Awakens. And from the air, you can see why. The jagged pinnacle, hemmed in by the ocean, is like nowhere else on Earth. Visiting Skellig in 1910, the Dublin-born playwright George Bernard Shaw described it as an incredible, impossible, mad place, and part of our dream world. Ireland. An ancient landscape inscribed with 10,000 years of human history and culture. An illustrated manuscript like no other.